Today we're at Newfoundland Memorial Park by Beaumont Hamel, and we're here to explore probably the best preserved section of the Western Front here by Beaumont Hamel. Newfoundland Memorial Park is a 74-acre area of preserved battlefield. It was purchased by the Newfoundland people in 1921, and it's been preserved as the largest memorial for a battalion here, with this whole park being in commemoration of them. Now there's other things here as well as Newfoundland related memorials. There's a couple of cemeteries and some other bits here, but there is also a huge amount of preserved trench line here that you get to see such detail, frontline trenches, communication trenches, that you don't get to see in other areas of the Western Front. And so we've come here to explore today, and I think it's going to be really, really interesting. So this whole area is just cratered and kind of riddled with old trench lines. You've got, to give you some kind of perspective, behind us over here we have the support line trenches, where the kind of reserve trenches were. And you guys who are a bit more familiar with kind of how the Western Front mapped out, you had a frontline trench, then you would have communication trenches that ran back from that, and then you'd have support line trenches, and so on and so on. So it really was kind of like a maze of trenches. It wasn't just like one line at the front. So behind us is where the kind of support line trenches were, and the communication trenches that worked their way through towards the front line. And then here behind me, this is what was the British frontline trench on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Across behind us here is no man's land, and over on the far kind of ridge line over there, that's where the German frontline trenches were. So this was no man's land. This was the battleground here on the first day of the Somme. The first guys to attack here on the 1st of July were the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, and they attacked here across no man's land, leaving this British frontline trench at about 7:30 in the morning. They attacked straight across here towards the German front line, and suffered some awful casualties. 568 killed, wounded or missing men. To the left of them over here, the 2nd South Wales Borderers attacked as well, towards the German fortress of Y Ravine, which is in the German front line across the other side of no man's land here. We're going to go look at that in just a minute. The initial attack had failed, and so reserve troops from behind here had to be brought forwards for the second wave of the attack. Okay, so just wanted to kind of reference that again, what we're talking about here. So this in front of us here is the British frontline trench. This is where the British left from on the first day of the Somme. Now, sometimes a bit of confusion when people visit here, because there is actually a second trench, or another trench I should say, dug further out into no man's land, and people will always wonder what that trench is for. Well, that's actually from later in the Battle of the Somme, where this attack here was unsuccessful. The Battle of the Somme carried on here until November of 1916. And in a latter part of that battle, there was a further trench built, advanced out there in no man's land, in order to make this ground a little bit shorter to cross. On the first day of the Somme, this was the British frontline trench right here in front of us. You can see it runs from over there, along here, down there to the left, and then across no man's land over there on that tree line is where the German front line was. Now you can see straight away, as soon as someone steps out of this frontline trench, they are going downhill across this open piece of ground with a clear view from the German front line. So we've come further back now in the Memorial Park, and this is the St John's Road support trench. Back here, the Newfoundlanders regiment, the guys who this park is named after, were waiting in order to move forwards in a later wave of the attack. After that first attack had suffered heavy losses and had ultimately been unsuccessful, these guys were tasked with moving forwards from this position. Now, they've actually got it set up here so that you can walk down into some of these trenches. They have kind of like sort of planks and stuff set up, so you're not just kind of walking on the actual ground, but you really get a good idea of kind of how these trench systems worked and the way in which they went through, and you kind of get a rough idea. You can't really see exactly where we are, but we're quite far back from what was the front line here, and this is where the Newfoundlanders started from. They had to start advancing through these communication trenches to get to the frontline trench. So we're now walking along what was the support trench, the St John's Road support trench. This section we've walked in is where it would have come through, and then up there ahead of us you can see where it would have continued along. So these guys had to start advancing forwards. Now, we're very lucky, we have this nicely made path. Those guys, however, were advancing along through these communication trenches to get towards the front line. Now, the problem was these communication trenches and the support kind of second row trenches just ahead of us were getting really filled up with casualties, wounded men trying to work their way back from the front line, queues of men trying to get forward to the front line. They were just absolutely congested, and their officers were worried that if they were taking too long to get towards the front line and therefore their attack was delayed, that it would cause more problems. So the Newfoundlanders were actually ordered out of their trenches back here by their support trench and had to advance above ground like we're doing right now towards the front line. Now we've come back forwards a little bit here, and you can see where these communication trenches would have run through towards the front, and they've actually got it set up so again you can walk through what was one of these communication trenches here. But the problem was around here was the area where, because it was so congested, these guys were ordered up and out of their trenches. Now, the problem with that is that this is where the ground has really opened up, and as soon as you step above ground here from the communication trench, you are really in the wide open, trying to advance forwards to your own front line. Okay, so we're now moving up through the communication trench. They've got this set up so you can walk through. This is where those guys were getting so bogged down, casualties trying to come the other way, dead men laying in these trenches who had gone over the top previously and had either fallen straight back down or maybe been dragged back in by their comrades. Casualties lying all over the place. They just couldn't get forwards. We're still a good distance back from the front line here, probably maybe not quite 100 meters, but a good distance back. And so as we walk through here and keep following the line of this trench, we're about to get a bird's eye view of what happens if you had to climb out of this communication trench and start pushing towards your own front line. Okay, so we're still here in the kind of support communication trench sort of area. So this is what happens if you have to climb out of this communication trench this far back from the front line. Let's go up these steps. And as soon as these guys did this, you see how exposed they were across towards the British front line, which is out there by that kind of second path ahead of us, and across to where the German front line is, literally just over by those trees. Advance. These guys were in the wide open, trying to advance forwards before they'd even reached their own front lines. So the Newfoundlanders were trying to cross this land that we're walking across right now, and you've seen the view across to the front line, and the reality of it is that they were just absolutely decimated. guys hit, killed and wounded before they'd even got to their own front line, trying to cross this open ground here. Some did get beyond the front line and started walking towards the German front line. Some got quite some distance across, but ultimately the Newfoundlanders regiment suffered 710 casualties, killed, wounded or missing here. Really was some awful losses here. That wasn't the last attack of the day here. The 1st Essex followed them and attacked as well. They too were absolutely devastated here. Massive losses. The Wye Ravine in the German defences over there proved to be an impenetrable fortress on the first day of the Somme, and in fact would stay that way right through until the latter parts of the Battle of the Somme, when it was finally captured. Now when you get out here to this part of no man's land, they have a tree, and this tree is named the Danger Tree. Now there's rumours that this is the original tree, but I think I've read that this is like a replacement tree. But there was a tree right here on this spot on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Now you can see we're not quite in the middle of no man's land. We're probably about a third of the way across, but where we are right here, you can see up here, sort of on the ridge line here, is where the British front line was, and this is where these guys were advancing towards the German front line over there. This is the part where things got really sticky for them, because they were crossing this slope. Now here you can see the land kind of drops down, and there's actually a little bit of a dip then kind of going back up. So I guess if guys made it to this point, they maybe had a slightly better situation than they had further back here. The problem was that they didn't, and in fact this tree represents pretty much the furthest point that these guys got as they attacked across no man's land here towards the German front line. So as we walk out here into the middle, this is where you get a real good perspective of kind of how open this was, and we're quite high up here, but the ground kind of drops down, and you can also see behind me here a good view. I mentioned there was another trench line. Well, that's that one that's out there behind us, that was dug later in the latter attack during the Battle of the Somme towards November, to try to shorten this ground. You know, the guys dug out and then built a new front line. So people often get confused and think that's the front line, but actually that was built later. The British front line on the 1st of July was the one we've looked at back there. You can see all the ground here is just absolutely peppered with shell holes. Some behind us here, some quite big ones actually, and all across. There's another pretty big one right there. And the thing that's becomes very apparent is that a lot of these shell holes are right around where the frontline trenches were. These shell holes in particular are all near that frontline trench that was later in November, but back up when you're up by the original front line as well, that entire area is just covered with shell holes. So you can see how the German artillery had these guys fairly well zeroed in and were giving them a hell of a time, as I'm sure the British were for the German front lines. But still, it really does demonstrate to you that it was not a good place to be. So we've come across now, so we're on the other side of no man's land, and over on this side they have the Wye Ravine Cemetery, which is where a lot of the guys who were killed here are buried, are laid to rest. Just wanted to quickly touch on, I mentioned that advanced trench, that was called the Wellington Trench, by the way. That's the one that was used in the latter attack towards the German frontline position here, and that was largely led by the 51st Highland Division, who successfully took Wye Ravine and the German frontline's positions here, but they also suffered terrible losses. And so Wye Ravine Cemetery has guys from Newfoundland Regiment and the various other regiments who attacked here, but we'll also see a lot of graves in here from the 51st Highland Division. So I just wanted to quickly reference that part of the story before we take a look in Wye Ravine Cemetery right here. So as we come in here, we straight away have quite a few graves here from the South Wales borderers. I mentioned that these guys are tacked off to the left here. Newfoundland memorial graves. A soldier of the Great War, Royal Newfoundland Regiment. So somebody who, you know, it would have been identified that they were part of the Newfoundland Regiment, maybe uniform or, you know, cap badge, something like that. But who the individual was unfortunately not able to be identified. Private Millward, South Wales borderers. Private Taylor, South Wales borderers. So I mentioned the Highlanders. We have Lance Corporal C. Mundell, the Gordon Highlanders, Private Mitchell of the Gordon Highlanders, and lots of others, lots of Highlanders graves here at Wye So we've just walked across the other side now to where the German frontline positions were, and you can see behind us some remains of where the German frontline trench went up. What's interesting here is they have Wye Ravine, which is a big natural landscape just behind us, and in fact we're going to talk all about that in a video coming up real soon, to keep an eye out for that video. But where you kind of lead forwards here into then the German front line, you really start to get an idea of the view that they had across no man's land here. Real strong protection, so they could have, you know, a lot of their soldiers down in the dugouts by Wye Ravine, probably sentries out here in the front, or some guys in the front line. Then when they needed to, bang, soldiers out in the front line manning those machine guns with clear views across no man's land here. So you really do come here, you get real perspective of why the attack here failed so badly, because of the view the Germans had across no man's land. So here's probably the best spot where you get a view of what I mean. I mean, this is a deep trench here, and sorry to confirm, this is the German frontline trench, but it's really deep compared to the British ones on the other side. It looks a bit wider too, so I imagine it was probably slightly more fortified, but they had been here for a long old time. They'd been in this section longer than the British had, and so really had a chance to dig in and dig defences properly. Now, for the attackers on the 1st of July here, success would be determined by their ability to take Wye Ravine, which is just over there through those trees behind us. Now, the problem they had was, you can see the way this land kind of slopes towards us, and then the way it drops off back through those trees into Wye Ravine. The attackers really could not see the detail of what it was, and just how fortified it was, which meant the Germans, safely down there in their bunkers, were able to hide away during the vast bombardment from the British prior to the first day of the Battle of the Somme. So just come on up on top by the Caribou Monument here. It's much busier in the park now, so I've been here really early in the day, but now it's getting into kind of regular hours, so there's lots of people turning up. I just thought I'd film some clips, because from up here you get a real good perspective of what went on here. So to give you an idea, off to the left here, this is where the support line trench was, so St John's Road trench through here, and through here is the communication trenches. So this is the land the guys would have had to cross before they got to their own front line. Where all these kids are now, this is the still the support line trench, and then out there on the other side of the fence you can kind of see running across in the field, like over kind of where that further path comes through, that is where the British front line trench was. And ahead of us there is no man's land, and on the far side, those trees over there, that's the German front line. So you really do get a great perspective from up here to see this piece of land. It's one of my favourite spots to be on the Western Front. This, A, because there's so much here to see, but B, just because you can really see the perspective of how a battle like this went. There are a few places on the Western Front where you can see a British front line, open no man's land, a German front line, and you really do get a clear idea of what happened here. I hope you guys enjoyed this look around the Newfoundland Memorial Park at the Somme nearby Monthamel. Favourite is a tough word to use when you're talking about the Somme battlefields, but it really is one of my favourite places to visit. It's a fascinating place and obviously a very tragic place as well. Thanks for joining me as I looked around. I'll see you on the next video.